All right, good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, April 5th, and General and Housing Committee will start work this morning. But first of all, we got a text this morning about Representative James tested positive for COVID. She felt symptoms over the weekend, took a test on Monday, came up negative, missed yesterday because she had flu-like symptoms, and then tested positive this morning. We will not see her this week. We're going to pick up work this morning on, this is related to S100. S100 passed the Senate Friday, I believe. Still is not posted. I'm hoping it's posted by the time we go on the floor so it gets brought over to the House. As I mentioned yesterday, there are sections. I think there's 40, last night I saw, 44 sections. The last one is effective date. We will be focusing on sections, the last 20 sections or so, which are housing related, and part of that will be a discussion about expanding the VHIP program which we already supported in our budget memo, and I believe that there was money in the House version of the budget for that, and so we'll have that conversation. But part of the conversation is expanding the use of it, expanding who can apply for that. And this is what this morning's conversation is going to be about. And in coordination, and we'll ask the witnesses, and I'll check with the chair of Human Services about other disability-related housing issues that are out there. But to start off this morning, we have two witnesses. We have Julie Tesler, who is the Executive Director of Vermont Council of Developmental and Mental Health Services from the Vermont Care Partners, and Susan Aronoff, who we've seen this year, who's the Senior Planner and Policy Analyst for the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. So, Julie, please join us.
Thank you very much. I do have a PowerPoint. Where do I plug in? Do I plug in?
No, you're on the Wi-Fi, right? Ron could make you a co-host.
You need to try to do it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I apologize for the delay.
Sure. No. And while you're lining that up, we'll, as this is your first time in committee in quite some time anyway, so saying that most of us are new to you would be an understatement, I think, in terms of this committee. So Representative Tom Stevens, I represent the Washington Chittenden District.
Joe Parsons, I represent Thompson, Groton, and Newbury.
Emily Krasnow, South Burlington.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax, Georgia.
Dennis LeBounty, Linden, Newark, Sutton, Sheffield, Wheelock.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows, and I represent Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
I'm Larry Leyburn. I represent Essex, Orleans, District 1.
And Mary Howard, I represent Rutland City, District 6.
Andrew Rutland, Bennington.
Thank you. And many of you hopefully are familiar with me because I feel familiar with you. Looking for my link. I'm not a good double tasker, so I couldn't look at you and also look at my link at the same time.
And I had you share it with Ron.
Yeah, it's on.
It's on our webpage.
Would you mind resending it to me? I'm just not finding it. Oh, I found it since I said it.
So Julie, just to frame it, I know you know what we're talking about, but just to frame it for folks, the idea of, well, you'll explain what's going on. I think that's why you're here. Our committee, just again, the VHIP program is a program that can, with a match, can provide a grant or a loan for up to $50,000 to help people renovate their apartments.
I had.
And in this case, it'll be about for home sharing for people.
No.
I would actually go ahead and this one first. And then you can do this by Joe. You don't mind me looking over your shoulder, I can get you there. Zoom. And then you're going to want to.
This would be an eligible use for.
It's not showing up. I don't know
That's so
why it's not
strange.
showing up. Oh, there it is.
Ah, that might be it. Here. Drop your camera.
So it's there.
Sorry, go
Did it
back.
come back?
No. Go back to Zoom. Okay, and then let's just go here. Just, shit, we're gonna.
Which one? Why don't you just go ahead and press it, because I'm not seeing it.
Share, and then bring that up. Nope. Try this again. There we go. Hit share, and now you can.
Find slideshow.
It's just gonna take a second.
There we go.
There you go. And then beginning.
All
And
right.
it's gonna take a few seconds, but you should be all set.
There we go.
Thank you for your patience. I apologize
No
for that. I'm not the youngest, most tech savvy lobbyist here. So I appreciate your time today. I am just going to give you more of the brief overview. Susan Aronoff from the Developmental Disabilities Council really is the brains behind what we'd like to present today, but I wanted you to have some background information, particularly for some of you who may be less familiar with designated specialized service agencies.
And if you could give us a quick synopsis of who the Vermont Care Partners are,
Yes, I
that
will.
would be great.
Okay, so that's.
Oh, there it is, okay.
Our mission is to provide statewide leadership for integrated, high-quality system of care for 16 nonprofit designated and specialized service agencies. We serve people in Vermont who have developmental disabilities, mental health conditions, and substance use disorders, and some other folks. Each agency is somewhat different because each community is different and there's a different range of resources in the community. But our focus is always to be person and family centered, to provide the services in the community. We're not come to the office and from 9 to 5. We're for people 24/7 in homes and schools and places of work, helping people get to work. And we really there to support our community. So sometimes, like when there was a car accident and youth were killed, and it really affected the Hardwich. I don't get these. Your community. Washington County's at the school for months, providing support to the community. So it's not just about individuals with high needs, although that's a focus. We're there to support our communities and work with community partners. So it's a very collaborative approach. And we feel like we're in some ways a safety net for people who really need supports. And sometimes that's short term and sometimes that's long term, particularly in developmental disabilities. It can often be long term. Hopefully you know your agency, but if you don't, I'd be glad to help you figure out what agency serves your community. And if you ever have issues from your constituents about services or have questions or are in need, please see me. I'm here a lot and I'm here as a resource to you, or send me an email. But all the designated agencies really have this requirement to meet the needs of their community. Zero reject. Anyone who comes to the door who has a mental health or substance use well, not so much substance use, that's a more preferred provider system, but mental health and developmental disability need, we have to meet their needs. Like, we can't say, this is too much, we have no idea what to do, or we don't have the resources. We have to figure out how to meet people's needs. And that's particularly important. From the pandemic, many more people went into crisis. Use of emergency services went way up. And it's not just people who have a mental health condition. All of us were experiencing anxiety, depression, suicide rates went up, overdose rates went up. So it's everyone who's in a crisis. And we even work with law enforcement, go out with them and provide crisis supports to people in need. Yep.
So just looking for, always trying to understand the networks because they're very confusing. So what's the relationship between you and the 16 agencies? Do they get funding through you? Are they
No.
under you or?
No, I have 16
collaborative,
bosses in my mind. I work for them. I do what they tell me. I represent them here. We negotiate an agreement with the Agency of Human Services. We work on best practices. We have about 20 different groups of human resource directors, our children's directors, our IT directors, all coming together, working as a network. So one advantage of not being this competitive system where we're all trying to compete with each other is we're all there to support each other as a network of care. So everyone is trying to raise best practices. We do our training for behavioral interventions in the schools statewide. We work with state government to work through policies to ensure we have adequate funding to meet the needs of the people we serve. To work through, like, how do we work in the schools or how do we work with the state police? So we're working as a whole network of care. The staff of Vermont Care Partners is 6 of us. So 6 of us can't do this job by ourselves. We're working with the finance directors and lead outpatient directors and experts in the field, all supporting each other. So the children's director at Counseling Services, Addison County, is incredibly talented. So if I had a policy issue I didn't understand, I might take it to all the children's directors as a group, or I might just go to her and say, help, I don't understand this issue, or can you help us work with state government through this? So we're really working as a very strong network of care. When I go to other states where they have all different providers, they don't have this network that's there to support people together as a system of care. So we feel really fortunate. I feel fortunate to work for this system because the people who do this work, the people on the ground level, oh my gosh, those are really hard jobs. And I think you've heard that we've had a workforce shortage. We've had vacancy rates that right now are slightly better than they were last year, but over 20% of the positions are vacant. So that means the other staff are working really long hours to make up for that. They're carrying really high caseloads. They're really pushing themselves hard, and then they're burning out. So it kind of gets into a downward spiral, but we're having a little improvement because the legislature, thank you, gave us an 8% Medicaid rate increase. And the governor came and recommended level funding this year when we had a 6.2% inflation rate. So thank you, House, for 4%, but my executive directors say, and that's still a cut. We still have to deal with the labor market. The pizza place is offering a lot more than we do for direct support professionals. People were asking to do overnight, 24/7, holidays. So we're still in a really difficult place. We will be asking the Senate if we could have a larger increase. And we've also, thank you to the House, looking to do tuition assistance and loan repayment to help grow our staff and help retain them. But it's a challenge. The DCF workers are making significantly more. People working in the state hospital making significantly more. So we're really cost effective for state government to use us, but you can only push so far and get quality services and accessible services. So we do have people waiting for services. But in developmental disabilities, everyone gets in who's eligible. But there's a tight door of who's eligible. Either you're graduating from high school and you have work lined up and it's a continuation of services, or otherwise you pretty much have to be in crisis. You have to be homeless, in need of an institution, in some really high need category to get in our door. Then you get a comprehensive wraparound services. And many of the people need residential support. So we're serving 4,663 people with developmental and intellectual disabilities, and that includes autism, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, a variety of needs. And the people we're serving, you don't, like all of us, you don't just have one condition. You may also likely have a mental health condition. You may have substance use issues. You may very likely have medical issues. So people's needs are really complex who come in our doors. And that's why we're providing a lot of 24/7 services to them. And that's why they'll be with us often for their life.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, knowing that it's not necessarily germane to S100, but to what degree do people in Vermont Care Partners receive cultural sensitivity training?
We're working, actually Vermont Care Partners, I mentioned we have a lot of groups. We do have one on anti-racism where every agency has a representative and we're working through different issues. Most of the agencies have also hired consultants to work with them and have anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion groups working on those issues. So we're continuing to work on it. And certainly some agencies like the Howard Center, where there's a large refugee population, have been very involved in this for a very long time. Other agencies are really picking up on it in the last few years.
I wasn't really asking about that. I have faith that you are working on that. I've been thinking a lot lately about agencies that have people riding along with the police and responding to emergent situations, and wondering whether the people who are responding to the emergent situations have cultural sensitivity training, because not every culture responds to an emergency in the same, or a mental health crisis, or in the same way. I wondered, since you're here and it's been on my mind, I just wondered whether that was a component of training that's received.
It is, that's part of onboarding, and particularly for people working in law enforcement, bias really comes up there quite a lot. So we definitely work on it. I can't say that I've surveyed every embedded worker to see what level of training each one has, but it's definitely part of our foundational work to ensure that it's yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
I mentioned people live in a lot of different settings. This is data from we keep a data repository. So many people live what we call shared living providers. These are individuals who have a contract with a designated or specialized service agency. And the specialized service agencies are like designated agencies, but they don't have that responsibility for a community. They're more likely to have a specialized expertise, and people can choose whether they want to use a designated agency or their local specialized service agency. So they have contract with shared living providers, and they get it. The shared living provider gets a stipend. They're not paid by the hour. They're just given a stipend to provide 24/7 support, although many of the people who lived in shared living may have employment, may have community activities. But with the pandemic, when our workforce has gone down, they're not out of the house as much as they used to be. So our shared living providers also are under more stress, just like our staff are under more stress. And these living arrangements often last for decades, literally. People become part of the family, and that's the goal, is that they're active in the community, they're integrated in the community. I actually had to double check this. It's not considered a tenant renter situation, but they do have an agreement, which we actually have to update due to the new CMS settings rule, and we're working on that right now. Vermont Care Partners had, for our member agencies, one of the things we did is worked on this, what is a standard agreement that people should have with their shared living providers for their living situation. But the shared living providers have a lot of requirements. They have to have a lot of accessibility. They have to have means of egress. The windows have to be so wide. There needs to be locks on the doors, which is new. And we are having a really hard time reviewing this work. Oh, they're also administering medication, so that's a huge responsibility right there. And they often hire their own respite workers so they can get some breaks. So we're having a hard time finding shared living providers. And when we've gotten increases in the past, they don't always get to go to the shared living provider. Sometimes they're just determined based on staff salaries and not on the contractors. So it's challenging work. It's hard to recruit. You may have seen like ads in your newspaper, looking for a nice gentleman is looking for a place to live, likes to go bowling. Yep. So we've got people waiting for that. A lot of people still live with family members. And I think what you may have started to hear about is parents older, my age or older, starting to think about mortality and what's going to happen to their loved one when they die, and where are they going to live, and what's the secure place for them. Even parents whose offspring live with shared living providers, they worry too. Like, how do you know that shared living provider at some point can say, I'm done, or they age out of place? Yeah.
Do you also provide respite workers too? Or, if I'm caring, let's say I have somebody living with me and I want to go on vacation for a week. Do I contact your agency to find a qualified, if you will, respite worker?
You're probably going to be hiring your own person. So you have a budget that you get with your stipend, which includes money to hire respite.
Now, is there some kind of guidelines that, you just can't hire anybody?
No, there have to be background checks and all of that.
Okay, so if you find somebody, then you send the name to who to have, to do a background check?
I don't know. I'm not involved in the details of that,
Okay.
but I could get back to you on that. A lot of times, people who are doing shared living will have an agreement with each other. Joe can come live with you for 2 weeks in the summer, and Jill can come over here for 2 weeks, next year, or, something like that. So the other shared living providers have already gone through all that. They're accessible and things like that.
Yeah, well, we did that, once the kids all grew up, so we had three bedrooms in our house available. So we did some, respite work, but my wife took care of all that stuff. So I didn't know, so we had a young woman, probably, well, I say young, to me she was about in her 30s. And, with no disability, no physical disabilities, just that she just needed, to be looked after, if you will. And, it was, she was a nice girl, and it, worked out good,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there's really a lot of close relationships that people form in these situations, and that's what we want. And sometimes it feels more like a roommate, and it can be a single person with a roommate that they provide support for, but that person can be like the person who provides, makes meals, that they can support each other. So
this is the reverse of the home share programs
Yeah.
that we've heard, where if I had an empty bedroom, I could offer that for someone just for company, if you will. But this is the folks who actually need a place to live, and the people who are providing it are, in essence, those looking for. They're not the ones who are overtly looking for company. They're looking to help the community by taking on these individuals who don't want to live in a house.
We had a nice sponsor spotlight. You may not have noticed it in the bigger, where a woman who was doing respite was like, I really do like this woman, and she needs a place to live. Come on over. And yes, she provides support and security for her and helps her with many things in life, but she has also found that the woman who lives with her has things to offer her too. And some of that is companionship. But some people have really high needs and need a lot of medical support, and nurses need to come in, and sometimes it's really involved. Some people don't sleep through the night, or need to be turned at night. So the payments are also based on the amount of work that it takes for the shared living provider to provide support. So it's called like difficulty of care payments when there's like just a lot of supports. And it's never more than 2 people and often it's 1 person.
So it's essentially like a care provider, it's a shared living and a care provider in some instances.
Yeah. There's always some level of care and support. If people could live independently, then they do. And we have 65 people living in apartments where staff can come in and provide some supports, but without kind of that 24/7 living together. Or they have some level of supervised housing, which actually is, so if someone has very high needs, and sometimes people can be violent and have difficult dysregulated behaviors. And sometimes you actually need 2 staff on. So in that case, it would be a supervised living situation where you've got staffing coming in shifts to provide safety and health and safety and supports for the person. So that's a very intensive situation. It doesn't mean that the person can't leave the house, but maybe they need to always be with someone when they leave the house to make sure that their behavior is under control and that there's no concerns with community safety. And that need seems to be kind of growing for that more intensive level of support. And we do have some people living in group homes. And again, we really focus on person-centered services, individualized services, but sometimes when people have really high needs, the best living arrangement can be a small group home, not a large 20-bed home, but a small group home. To provide support. And that model, because again, you have staff coming in and out, you're asking them sometimes, and you need 24/7 staff because of the level of needs. Often you have a nurse coming in to provide medical supports. It can be an expensive model and less individualized. So our focus really is independent, and we're listening to families, we're talking to families who they feel very often that the shared living provider, they feel a little insecure with that because the family could, just like them, die one day or move on. So they'd like to see more staff models of care. And that's just going to be take more resources to do. So the state will need to add resources to achieve that. And I hope Susan will talk about the housing report that Developmental Disability Council developed that was just excellent and shared a lot of great information about housing models. So I mentioned that people often have more than they just don't have a developmental disability. They can have a lot of needs. And so we were noticing that a lot more people we serve in developmental disabilities have been going into crisis and their complexity of needs have really been increasing. So we surveyed that. And we found that there was 250 people in our program that were living as a gastro respite recipient with no feasible housing option in the foreseeable future, in the next couple of weeks. We had to just kind of pick a date. Sometimes people are living in hotels with staff support. That is not like what we want, but sometimes we just don't have a place for a person to go. And sometimes they'll be living with family, but in a situation that's not tenable in the long run. And when it's not tenable, they can go into crisis. Sometimes they'll show up in emergency departments and a psychiatric crisis. We've had overdoses, like these are people with real lives that have more challenges in some ways to navigate the world, and we're all having problems navigating the world. So this is just a shared thing, but it's some folks are in really difficult places. And sometimes they get stuck in inpatient or emergency departments because it's like there could be an incident of violence in a shared living provider. They go to the emergency room and the shared living provider says, I am now done. This was scary. I can't do this. I don't feel safe. And then the persons there in the emergency department or inpatient and there's no place for them to go. A person who has done something violent, it's really harder to find a living situation or set up, even if you set up a staff living, that takes time. You got to find the apartment, you got to hire up staff, you've got to train the staff. So we've got this backup going on, and people not in the best environment during this backup. So it's a really critical issue. And we certainly, one of the reasons we survey is to really understand it and to share that information with state government. So we need a broader range of accessible, and that's one thing. Like if someone, we can find the shared living provider, but their home isn't accessible, then what? Like you have to, take the time, find the resources to do it. If we can find an apartment, it needs to be affordable. We need to figure out the options. A few months earlier, we had done a survey of people in crisis, and we found 8% of the people we serve are in crisis or at risk. A real need for crisis beds, either transitional or respite beds, and more permanent and transitional type housing, like to get someone through when they've had a really bad episode. You can work with them and work through skills and help them get to a better place, but that can take time, and that's what a transitional placement would be about. So we're hoping, and I think Susan will talk more about, we're hoping that perhaps the Vermont Housing Improvement Program could be, a piece of a puzzle to move us forward. We need new shared living providers. We want to retain existing ones. It would be great if there was a way to get some of these funds to them to address health, safety, accessibility requirements, both for new ones and existing. And, they all need to now put locks on doors. And they're not officially landlords. They contract with the designated and specialized service agencies. So you might need language around that if you were willing to do this. But the end result would reduce homelessness, add stabilization. We could reduce that backup in the hospitals and shelters, and also help us keep shared living providers in their role providing shared living, and help us maybe even find some landlords for staff models for those high need folks. So that's what I'd like to present today. I don't know how you do this, but if you're willing, I appreciate your learning about this, our services and the people that we're serving in this program, and appreciate your time today.
Sure. Thank you, Julian. I think I'll hold my questions till after Susan. You do it. Great. Please stay so that if we have questions.
I get out.
Oh, so just hit stop.
Okay.
Stop sharing, and then you're gonna wanna leave.
Not physically.
Still stay.
On a committee.
Do it.
Welcome back, Susan.
Hey, good morning. For the record, Susan Aronoff, I am the Senior Planner and Policy Analyst for the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council. And I always have to start all of my public testimony with a certain kind of a disclaimer. I am a state employee. I'm housed in the Agency of Human Services. However, I am an employee of the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, which is a creature of federal law. All 50 states and territories have a Developmental Disabilities Council. Under our federal law, and with a memorandum of agreement that we have with the Agency of Human Services, in order for Vermont to get the federal money that funds us, they have to house and feed us, give us some technical support, which we now pay for, by the way. And also, we are free to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities and their family members, and depart from what the Agency of Human Services or the governor or the Department of Disabilities, Aging, and Independent Living, and any other state agency, any positions they might take. I, as an Agency of Human Services employee would usually be prohibited under personnel policies from taking a public position contrary, but under our memorandum of understanding, I am free to speak. However, I'm not entirely free to speak. I am governed by a council. I'm an employee of a council. The council is made up of 60% of people with disabilities and their family members. The council every year, the council has a policy committee. Julie has 16 bosses. I have 23 bosses. The policy committee and the council, they adopt a platform every year. We still don't respect trees enough, so I'm going to pass out a couple paper copies of our current platform. I think you might have all received it at one time. We also completed a housing report, which I think you've received by email, but if anyone wants a paper copy, I brought that too. Anyway, one of the items in our platform is something called Housing for All. And I really want to thank the chair. Well, I want to start out by thanking the chair and all of you for having us in today to talk about this issue. But I really want to thank the chair for planting the seed of this idea with the council. So a couple of years ago, this committee was really instrumental in addressing eugenics and the history of eugenics. And this is really, the context of today is that 2023 is the 30 years since we closed Brandon Training School. 30 years. And 30 years ago, then Governor Dean made a promise to the families and to the people living at Brandon that they would be supported in the community. And you know what? I have to tell you, and you've talked to a lot of these people yourselves, there are a lot of parents and families in Vermont who want to know, without Brandon, what else is there? And I'm not saying that anyone from any organization wants another institution, but I will tell you, the state of Vermont right now is building more institutions. We are building a nursing home for the geriatric site community. We are building an inpatient facility for people who are not competent to stand trial, including people who are not competent because of disabilities. And 30 years after the closing of Brandon, we should not be building new institutions if we're not also building new housing. This housing report was commissioned by Act 186 of last year. The bottom line is that we need 600 more units of what's called service-supported housing in the state right now. Julie will tell you, we have 100 people waiting for shared living providers right now. And then you saw the number of people who are living with their families right now. People who get into the small pool of people who qualify for services and who are either waiting in hotels or living with their families.
Will you pass one of those down?
Yes. So when I came to the State House for the Eugenics Apology public event, I had a private conversation with Mr. Chair, and I said, Mr. Chair, what would the eugenics justice look like for people with disabilities? It would be community housing outside of institutions, brand enclosed community housing. And Mr. Chair rightly said, well, what would have to change? What would that look like? So I put that to a council. And we basically have 3 concrete asks, and I'd be happy to work with anyone on language. I'm a recovering lawyer. The 3 concrete asks in order of simplicity or complexity go like this. The first part of the home improvement program, please allow all landlords to be eligible for that funding to make access renovations in addition to code violations. So maybe they're totally up to code, but they'd like to be accessible. They'd like a ramp. They'd like an accessible first floor. Please, we need more accessible housing for everyone. I think that one's pretty straightforward, and I would not anticipate any opposition to including more straight up landlords. Our shared living providers, as Julie said, are not landlords, but this would be for all the people who are landlords. They could renovate their homes. More people would be able to age in place, more people with disabilities. of all stripes would have access to housing. Second, include people with disabilities, and I know you're gonna need some way to define them, so I'd be happy to work with anyone on language. Maybe they have to get social security, maybe they have to get home and community-based services, some cutoff of people with disabilities in the list of the preferred tenants. So including people who were currently unhoused or coming out of corrections, people receiving Medicaid-funded home and community-based services, seniors on choices for care, are people who really struggle to find housing, accessible housing, and otherwise are at risk of institutionalization. To get Medicaid funded home and community-based services, you have to meet really high levels of like either eligible for nursing home level care or, whatever the bars are. So that could be an appropriate cutoff. But anyway, include some subset of the people with disabilities and the preferred tenants. So the third ask, and this is the one that, that's why Julie's here to talk about shared living providers, is to include specifically the people who house people who get Medicaid funded services. So either the people who house them as shared living providers, and that would be a huge incentive. I don't know about you guys, it kind of breaks my heart when I read those ads about a housing wanted for, I feel like I'm reading the ads from the Humane Society. It's really tough. And you can't say a forever home like you can for the Humane Society because the shared living providers can turn over. And that's what really keeps the parents from there's an amazing parent group in this state right now, 100 families strong. You guys have probably all run into them. They are the DDHI, Developmental Disability Housing Initiative. And they formed because they are not comfortable with this model that asks them to have their loved one go live in someone else's house. Why not allow them to receive the stipend, etc.? So we might not be able to get them to receive the stipend, but at least maybe they could modify their own house or build an auxiliary whatever the AUDs, the language, ADUs in their own home. So that if they're going to house their loved one, they could at least have privacy and walls or rooms. So allowing the people who are housing our people with disabilities right now, that's where the people who would have been at Brandon or Waterbury State Hospital or other places are. They're living with their Vermont families, and our Vermont families are stressed. Services just came to a complete halt during the pandemic. School services, community services. So people who were shared living providers became 24/7 care providers, and people who were family members providing housing also became 24/7 care providers. So we would really like to see people who are housing people who receive this Medicaid funded community-based services be able to make the home improvements necessary to really safely support someone with a disability. I have a council member right now. She uses a wheelchair. She lives in a home in Addison that was specifically modified to support someone. She has to use a Hoyer lift to use the bathroom. So she has a track in the ceiling. She wants a new shared living provider. She's been told there's no one out there for you. And that's just heartbreaking. But if someone was interested in housing her and they wanted to put a track in the ceiling, it would be great if they were able to do that under the same terms as the HIP program. So anyway, that's our ask. And I won't take up any more of your time, but I'd be happy to take questions. And I do, before I want to finish, I just also want to thank the committee as a whole and Member Burrows for your support and work for accessibility for people with disabilities. We've noticed it this session. It's not gone unnoticed. It's tremendous. Thank you.
2 questions. If someone is a shared living provider and their person moves on, I mean, I know sometimes that they could be, as we heard, they could be decades long relationships, but just like in home shares, the other home shares, people move on. And do those families who have been shared living providers tend to take on more individuals if they've had a decent
Yes.
experience?
Yes, I think that some who are set up to do that, they do, and part of it is that, honestly, it's a huge cash infusion into their lives and they're set up to do it. I've met a couple, so one thing that our program does is we run an annual leadership training program for people with disabilities and their family members. And I've had a number of shared living providers come through that program with some of the people living for them. And I know a few from that program who absolutely take on new people if their person moves. They really like it. It's like a good lifestyle for them. And they're engaged in the community and they're engaged in their agencies and they are the social civics coaches in their community and they do a lot of transportation and they're very engaged. There are absolutely people in the shared living system that are in it, that are really invested in it and believe in the model. I mean, this is the interesting thing. 30 years ago, when Vermont was the second state to close its institutions for people with developmental disabilities, other states still have a lot of them open. I worked in a state, Connecticut, still has one, very active. It was a really kind of leading edge model to pay people in the community to house other people. And it was a way that was always described as, you know, there were a lot of people in Vermont who were property rich and maybe cash poor, that was the phrase, who might have larger homes and extra rooms and wanted to open their homes up and they were compensated. And I think the amount of money has just gone, because it hasn't changed, it's just not as attractive now as it used to be. But it used to really allow people to be artists, stay at home, do specialty foods, you know, and have this other income coming in and support someone and bring diversity into the community. I mean, all the things that Vermont likes to pride itself on, shared living providers, that's who does it. You know, I came home from a conference in DC about people with disabilities. And I was picked up at the Burlington Airport, and the thing I wanted to do was get a creamy at Lake Champlain and get out over the water. When I went to get the creamy, I saw not one, but two people out with people with disabilities out with their shared living providers on the creamy line, getting the creamies and hanging out. And it's like they were having the same experience I was having. And that's not what happens in other states. That's what shared living allows. That's why it's a beautiful model. And we need more of it. So, but it needs to be supported and safe, you know, all those other.
If money were made available or if this program were expanded, because what I heard is not just, what I heard is a simple-ish fix, depending on what the consequences would be, to the language that already exists for landlords, for people who may rent to people with disabilities. But also perhaps a separate section, I mean, because I would be concerned if there was X amount of dollars that if money wasn't put aside for shared living providers or made available only to shared living providers, that if it was a purely competitive standing with landlords, that it just may not be distributed in a way that would be helpful.
Oh.
There's going to be issues with that as well, but that's language that we can work on.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, so all of that said, right now the VHIP money is appropriated to DHCD, which then distributes it to the NeighborWorks organizations because they're the ones who work with landlords. If there was money made available strictly for shared living providers, who do you think would be in charge of accepting those applications? Would that be something through the existing AHS system of other funding, or so they would have to recreate this program to a degree in a different department? Or do you think it would be more just as comfortable being if shared living providers had to contact the affordable housing, you know, the downstreets, the CHTs, the rural edges of the world, who already have this program set up? And again, the way that if $5 million has been, in the past, if $5 million has been appropriated, $1 million goes to each of these equally to the organization, not on a per capita basis, though we're still in a pilot form. So, we're still in a pilot system every year. So I'm just curious, like where do shared living providers go for funds anyway?
So one of the things that I want to just back up and mention is that within the Agency of Human Services, there are several departments that support people with home and community-based services. So home and community-based services, this phrase I keep using, HCBS, it's a really big thing in the Medicaid world.
Yeah.
And so I would like to suggest that this should be something that regardless of if you're like a client of the Department of Mental Health, they have some programs, CRT, community rehabilitation and treatment, where they house people. Choices for Care, which is a program for seniors and people with physical disabilities, also house people not just with the home share, but with adult supervised, it's called the adult care homes. But it's similar to these, to shared living providers, and then the shared living providers for people with developmental disabilities. Because they're all Medicaid funded HCBS providers, I'd like to say that Agency of Human Services, which now has a new housing person again, they were without one, might be able to handle this administratively. I would like to think so. Because it's bigger than Vermont Care Partners. I'm getting a little skepticism perhaps. But I think if Agency of Human Services was tasked with doing it, they might rise to the occasion. They are as invested, I think, in beefing up our community housing opportunities. So as a little side note, in the world of home and community-based services, HCBS, Vermont is under one plan of correction for rules that were supposed to take effect in 2016. We're about to be under another one for rules that were passed in 2016. Everyone knew was coming. They were pushed back, but they actually went into effect on St. Patrick's Day, 2023. They're the rules Julie was referring to about now there's going to be locks on the doors. It's called the settings rule. And the state knows that we're not near in compliance with the settings rule. So I would think that Agency of Human Services, and I'll try to reach out to get someone they're interested, would take this on. Because they do have a housing person. So the department.
Housing person is right now?
No.
Do you have a name for that person, or we could find it?
Yeah, I would want to talk to Shayla Livingston at the Agency of
Sure.
Human Services. I know she has some concerns about their capacity to administer grants.
Yeah, everybody does.
Yeah, so I think she would probably prefer that it continue to go through the housing organizations, but I haven't asked the question yet, so.
Okay, no, because I mean, I'm seeing this as not just a simple. The first simple fix is landlords, putting it into.
The access part.
But the other piece is also money. I mean, how many, do you have, and today's not the day to get the fine. We should have you back relatively soon if you have deeper numbers, like, so when you say, well, VHIP applies right now to up to $50,000 with a 10 or 20% match. That's a lot of renovation. I mean, I know it's not as much as it used to be, but still that's more than a door jamb.
Yes.
But it could be less than a bathroom and a kitchen.
Yes.
So like what would be needed, understanding what would be needed. But I'm concerned just right off the bat of if you're splintering off money, if there's $1 million available and $50,000 is going to some different desk, as you just explained, like it's going to get lost in the shuffle and people may not know.
Yeah.
And it would be helpful if people have one place to go.
The person who didn't, the third witness today was going to be from our Vermont Center for Independent Living. They administer a federally funded the Little State contribution, I think, home access program. They're the folks who would have the numbers on what does it cost to generally to put in a new door, a ramp, and an accessible bathroom. And that's pretty much all they're allowed to do. And they used to have like 15,000 per person who was eligible, and that does not cover those renovations anymore. But they would have the numbers on that. And so, you know, if there was a different cap for access modifications that was based in those numbers, I don't know that people would object to that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find a
Make
place
places accessible.
that people don't have to keep going and saying, I mean, I know that that's how our structures are, especially with all the different silos that we have.
Well, to be up to that point, Mr. Chair, one of the things in our platform and one of the things that we're just hoping for as an organization is that housing for people with disabilities can become more integrated into all housing policies and programs. So if it stayed with the housers, and the shared living providers had to figure out how to access that system, great. We really are, you know, our agency is new to housing because it's newly in our 5-year plan. And one of the things that we've just been constantly surprised by is how many doors you have to go to work on housing. You know, and we're just a staff of two people, but we have to contact all these regional housing and, you know, and I just can't even imagine if I was a person trying to get on every waiting list. So.
Oh, there's a huge ongoing conversation about how many 15-page applications should any one person have to fill out to try to get these entitlements or benefits.
Yes.
The other question I had with respect to service supported housing, have you been working with the Human Services Committee and or had discussions with the Human Services Committee on that as well?
Yes, and so the Human Services Committee last year came up with what became Act 186, which is in the process of rolling out now, where money was made available for planning grants for service supported housing. The next ask is going to be for the funding for those projects, but we're already working with our congressional members and other sources because, you know, what we're realizing is to line up funding, you need to line up lots of funding from multiple sources. But we do want to explore, not for this session, Mr. Chair, but some way of actually trying to have, if it would be set aside, you know, 10% of all new housing would be for people with disabilities, something like that. They do that in other states. We don't know enough yet to know. This housing study was the first step in identifying the need. Now that we identified the need, we want to start figuring out systemically what 600 units is a lot. So how we know there's a lot of housing being built now. So how can we get some of the units that are being constructed now to be set aside to meet the needs of some of those 600 people?
And just, you know, anecdotally, there's a project that's being proposed in Waterbury, for downtown Waterbury, and I don't know everything about it, but I did hear that out of the 24 units or 23 units, that 3 were being put aside for the people with developmental disabilities in a partnership with the Upper Haven, which again is not local to Central Vermont, but it's that they clearly have the capabilities to do that or the skills to do that. And so I just want to, again, that's one way, but again, three down in a couple of years, and 597 to go isn't really good enough.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say in South Burlington as well, I just visited some new development and they will, again, it's a few, but folks at least are starting to be aware that this is really important. And I wanna thank you all so much and you know, this is a top priority for many of us and I really thank you and
And it's been in the shadows for a very long time. And,
yes.
You know, 600 units is a lot, but it's also only 600 units. statewide. So and we know from the work that we've done so far that that's only about $500 million. So, that's the other wave that we're working with. So, but I do appreciate the focus. I think we'll be working with, when it comes to service supported housing, we'll be working with we'd have to work with human services. For the VHIP money, we're gonna have a conversation. We're gonna continue to have a conversation over the next week or so while we're working on this 100. And we'll see what we can move forward.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.